When Jeanette led us and a number of people from the First Presbyterian Church here in Chicago in forest bathing a couple of weeks ago, she ended our time as we were standing in a circle with an invitation about reciprocity. For those of you who have never done it before, forest bathing is an intentional way of being present with the more than human world, using all of one's senses and paying attention in new ways. There's much that's been written about the health benefits of engaging in forest bathing. The trees emit something called phytoncides, and there's actually healing in the soil. Jeanette was asking us how we can reciprocate after receiving the gifts of the trees, the plants, the water, the soil, the birds, the animals. It's not an easy question to consider for so many of us who are used to approaching the natural world as something to see, enjoy, do activities in, and explore, or as something to save. We've been talking the past few weeks about the traditional Christian account of creation, which often leads us to embrace a story about how humanity is at the pinnacle of creation, which leads us then to see ourselves as over or better than the rest of creation. It also leads to this sense that creation exists for our use and enjoyment and our very lives. In that story, which we're trying to change and create new stories around, we're not asked to consider the question of reciprocity, and in fact, it would seem kind of absurd. Though we're to be stewards of, which some people define as caretakers of, some define steward as having control over creation, and so we don't think anything about reciprocity. So as we stood around the circle wondering how we could do anything to reciprocate, one by one, people began to come up with some ideas. One person had carried a bag so that they could pick up trash along the way as we were doing forest bathing. Another person suggested we could sing to the more than human world. Another one suggested we could donate money to organizations that are preserving spaces and caring for spaces like the one we were in. Little by little, people began thinking about ways they could not only feel gratitude for the more than human world, but also express that gratitude tangibly. Reciprocity is a complicated concept, and one that I think needs some unpacking and exploring. When I think of reciprocity, I naturally think of relationships with other humans. More specifically, I think of friendships. There is a kind of unwritten rule in friendships whereby one person should never be the one to always initiate, always cook, always pay for ice cream, or always be the one to send a card. Over the years, I've heard so many variations of how friendships end because one person seems to be doing most of the work in the friendship. I've heard the same about marriages, of course, but most of us first experience this concept of reciprocity through our friendships. When you're young, if you always invited your friend to your house and never got invited to their house, you began to wonder what was up. As you get older, if you always call or text your friend and they never call or text you, you begin to wonder why you're the one always doing the thing. There are some people, and you may be one of them, who feel strongly that if a friend doesn't reciprocate with invitations, reaching out, and showing support, then that person isn't a true friend. There are also people, and we might be among them, who keep very close track of who has done what or given what in the context of a friendship. I've had people tell me a friendship ended when one person gave their friend a birthday gift and the friend didn't give them one. I've also had people tell me I should end a friendship because the friend is so terrible at reaching out or initiating. This particular version of reciprocity means everything is supposed to be relatively equal. It doesn't seem to leave room for the giving of a gift with nothing in return, or the invitation without expectation, or even for the fact that sometimes people have more or less capacity to do or to give things. So we have to ask, what is reciprocity in the short term, and what is reciprocity in the long term? With so much baggage that we seem to carry about reciprocity in relationships, how can we begin to reframe it when we think of reciprocity with the more than human world? Sometimes, not always, it helps to look at texts in the Bible that have to do with a concept. I don't think reciprocity is one of the red words in the Bible, meaning Jesus probably never uttered it. Now, for those of you who don't know, the red letter edition of the Bible has words in red that Jesus said exactly. Mind you, there were no recording devices, no, voice recorders or video recorders. There weren't even ways for people to take notes fastidiously while Jesus was speaking, but these are supposed to be the exact words of Jesus, and reciprocity is not among them. But we can also think in terms of the concepts. So when I began thinking about stories of reciprocity, or something close to it, I thought of the story of Rahab hiding the spies, and then when the attack on the town happens, the spies then rescued Rahab and her family. That's kind of like reciprocity. And then as far as concepts go, the first thing that came to mind for me is what we often call the golden rule. Jerry read the text in Luke that ends with, treat people in the same way that you want to be treated. I think this concept really begins to get at the idea of reciprocity. What I find interesting are all the verses just before that last verse, which paints a different picture. Loving your enemies and doing good to those who hate you, and blessing those who curse you, and praying for those who mistreat you, is like the exact opposite of reciprocity. If someone hates you, love them. But at the end, it brings it together, and it's basically saying, treat this person like you want to be treated. You don't want to be hated in return, or cursed in return, or mistreated in return. Instead, it's up to you to break the cycle. So it's not exactly a picture of reciprocity, but it's getting close. Trying to consider how you want to be treated, and then treating another that way, is a huge step toward empathy. if I can imagine how I would want to be treated in a scenario and then commit to treating another person that way, I'm using both empathy and compassion. The reciprocal part is the part that connects us. We both want to be treated this way. I want to share a story about my partner Jeanette to illustrate this. One day last year on the bike path near our house, she witnessed a horrible and deadly car accident. She heard a loud noise, turned to look, and witnessed a car flying off of Lakeshore Drive and onto the grass near the bike path and into a tree. Somewhere in the time it left Lakeshore Drive and hit the tree, it exploded into a huge ball of flames. She later found out that 2 men died in the crash. As you might imagine, she was distraught about the whole experience. One of the sadnesses for her was the loss of life of this large and beautiful tree that died when the car hit it. She decided the next day, after the debris had been cleared away, to go and grieve the loss of life and the loss of the tree. She didn't know the people or their families or communities, so she didn't know specifically how to grieve them. She did know the tree that had died because of how often she passed it and acknowledged it. When she got to the spot, she realized there were 3 other trees nearby, and she hadn't seen them the day of the accident. Because of what she has studied about trees, she knows that they were all connected in their whole system underground, and that they might be grieving the loss of the large tree. She wondered if the tree that died might have been the mother tree. She knew there wasn't much she could do, but she wanted to do something. So she went to the trees that were still standing around the burned out spot, and she stayed with them a while and acknowledged their loss. And even though this is a more extreme example, I share it because I think this begins to get at what reciprocity is with the more than human world. Day after day, while riding her bike, she had been able to enjoy and see and receive carbon dioxide and many other things from this tree and these trees. And she wanted to be with them in some way in return. It's not ours to know if a tree actually grieves, or if a tree knows if you're standing nearby. It is ours to think about how to treat trees in the ways that we want to be treated. There's another story from forest bathing when we were in North Carolina that illustrates this. On this particular day, we were in a section of the forest near a stream, and we were there for 3 hours. And somewhere in the midst of the 3 hours, Jeanette issued an invitation that was about reciprocity. She asked, after receiving the healing and the gifts of the forest, is there anything you would like to give back? Kind of like the question she asked us a couple of weeks ago. But she added this part. She asked each of us to consider what we specifically might have to offer the forest. And so she encouraged us to go back out into the many places and be thinking about, what do I specifically have to offer? And she told us not to rush it. She said, if you will wait, if you will be patient, you will know what is yours to offer. And what she said ended up being true. Later that evening, we shared what things we had chosen to give to the forest that we specifically had to give. One woman said, "I can't walk a lot, and so I chose a spot to sit down in. And as I sat, I realized there was this small tree trying to push its way up, but all these dead leaves had gathered around it, and it wasn't getting any sunshine." She said, "So I just sat there and cleared away a spot so that this tree would have space to grow." I shared that because I know how to celebrate people's lives, I decided to do a celebration of life for a tree that had died and had many trees around it living off of its decay. Another person shared that she wrote a poem and ended up reciting it to a group of trees. Another person shared the water from their water bottle with a tree that looked like it was drier than some of the others. As we debriefed, many of us commented on how unusual it was for us to think about how we could reciprocate with the more than human world, and especially with trees and plants and flowers and moss that are not in our yard, that just exist in the world. When we walked through the woods, wondering what we specifically could give, we walked differently. We tried to take time to notice what the trees or the things around the trees might want or need from us. Reciprocity is more about showing up and being present than it is about matching what someone or something has given to you. What I like about the idea of reciprocity is that it gets us, and especially those of us who are white, out of our saving mindsets, as though we are supposed to save all. We are much more uncomfortable with the concepts of relationship and reciprocity, and much more comfortable with saving, because in the saving we retain all of the power. Many years ago, I began a relationship with Father Flager, who many of you have certainly read articles about and heard about here in Chicago, and then through him with the St. Sabina community. Initially, our relationship was very one-sided. We needed Father Flager. We invited him to speak at our vigils. He agreed, and then he would bring many of his community with him. It was clear at the time, and not just to me, but to many of us, that we did not have a lot to offer in return. They did not need anything from us. But by way of reciprocity and relationship, I realized that the most I could do was just show up. So I began showing up at various rallies and protests and marches and actions, and inviting many of you to do the same. It still seemed so ridiculously lopsided. He was giving us way more than we were giving him or them. But while we were not engaged in equal exchanges, we were engaged in reciprocity. It has taken years of simply showing up and having many of you show up as well for the relationship to deepen. On New Year's Eve day of 2021, Father Flager asked us to co-sponsor the March Against Gun Violence down Michigan Avenue, and we did. We partnered together in that effort. after years of simply showing up, we have more clarity around the work we're doing together and around the work that is ours to do separately. Why would it be any different with the more than human world? Many of us are just beginning our showing up and being present in a completely different way with the forests and the trees and the birds and even the water. We're shifting away from this mentality of you exist to please me or entertain me or bring me joy to a mentality that says we're co-creating a world we want, and our relationship of reciprocity is one of the ways we do this together. Until Phyllis Look led Jeanette and me and a whole group of people forest bathing in Hawaii, I thought of the natural world as the place where I did all of my activities, hiking and walking and swimming and kayaking and cycling and camping and backpacking. I tried to do the right things in terms of cleaning up after myself, trying to mitigate my impact, caring for the space. But I did not for a second think of trees as interconnected beings that communicate and work with each other and offer healing to us in any way. I had been, over time, learning about how different a relationship I had with the natural world than many native people have had with the natural world. But I was not connecting it to the hierarchical relationship suggested by traditional Christian teaching. The beautiful and the challenging aspect of knowledge and of understanding is that once we learn and experience something, we can't go backwards and undo it. For that, I am grateful. And for that, I am responsible. And so are you. We're exploring in these weeks how we want to write and live stories in the future that are life-giving and sustainable and based on the fact that we are part of an inescapable network of mutuality, in the words of Dr. King, and that our network extends to the more than human world. One of the invitations for us to consider is what it means to develop relationships of reciprocity when possible. Not all of our relationships are meant to be reciprocal. I want you to hear that. We have relationships that are not meant to be reciprocal. So we need to know the difference. But how can we consider reciprocity with the more than human world? It doesn't mean feeding the animals, by the way. When we went to the bird sanctuary a couple weeks ago, there are signs up that say, don't feed the birds. They actually have to find food for themselves. And yet, well-meaning, terribly misguided people continue to show up and dump bags of birdseed around the bird sanctuary. That's not reciprocity. So we also have to ask, what is reciprocity really? We know more and we have experienced more of the natural world than ever before. How will we be changed by what we know and have experienced? How will we live differently because of those changes? I always want to leave with an idea, right? One solid first step is to just begin by showing up for and in the more than human world around us and working on being fully present there. That's a step. Amen.